Hello and welcome to Democracy and Dictatorship. Free elections form the backbone of any democracy, and a failure to allow people to govern themselves is symptomatic of authoritarian regimes. In recent times, the digital and online space have captured the campaign trail, the electorate, and elections. Politicians have had to up their game in order to stay relevant, and voters have found new space in support or hold their leaders accountable. Social media has taken over our lives in a big way. Your phone is the access point to so much information and misinformation, and we cannot deny the impact that has on the election process. So in today's episode, we're going to look at how the digital and social media have changed elections. Has it made the process more democratic, or has democracy become a casualty of it? How far will the online really affect the offline? To start things off, here's our correspondent Giles Gibson taking a look at the use of the digital in recent elections across South Asia.
In the UK, people could always tell when an election was coming. Political posters filled the streets for weeks before election day. But now parties are pouring campaign funds into social media, with traditional posters disappearing from the streets. And the digital revolution is coming fast in South Asia too. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi is the most followed person on Twitter in India, with over 23 million followers. Meanwhile, the Aam Aadmi Party used social media to connect with their network of volunteers. In Pakistan, the 2013 elections saw a big rise in digital campaigning, but television remains the most important way to reach the country's voters. In mayoral elections in Bangladesh's capital, Dhaka, parties used Facebook to connect with potential supporters. The ruling Bangladesh Awami League's national Facebook page has over 1.5 million likes. But with digital catching on across the region, some countries are still using traditional communications tools. Bhutan held its second ever elections in 2013, and communication tactics will only develop as the country's fledgling democracy. Political parties in South Asia are moving fast into digital campaigning. In India alone, there are already over 350 million mobile internet users. As more and more people go mobile, political parties will be following closely behind. Giles Gibson, Wion, New Delhi.
We are talking about elections, so how can we not bring in America, which goes to polls next month? We've seen social media being used in a big way by both the candidates, Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. There's also a lot of information being shared, some nasty bits too. For many observers, the actual election process may come across as complicated. Every democracy has its own version of elections. Here's our correspondent, Archit Shashadri, explaining how the American one works.
Thank you.
The United States elects a president every 4 years. Election day is always the first Tuesday in November after the first Monday.
The American people will come first once again.
This year, it will be on Tuesday, November the 8th. To qualify, you have to be a natural-born U.S. citizen, be at least 35 years old, and a U.S. resident for 14 years. The election process starts at the voters pick a candidate through primaries and caucuses. After this, the two major political parties in the U.S., the Democrats in blue and the Republicans in red, host a nomination convention to unite behind one candidate. Each nominee also chooses a vice president candidate at this time. This year, Democratic candidate Hillary Clinton picked Virginia Senator Tim Kaine. Republican candidate Donald Trump chose Indiana Governor Mike Pence. The candidates tour the country through campaign rallies where they explain their views on hot-button topics like domestic policies, foreign policies, the economy, terrorism, gun control, immigration, jobs, and healthcare.
I believe one of the jobs of the president is to encourage more service.
The politicians have talked about this for years, but I'm going to do it.
A lot of states in the U.S. are typically red or blue states, but sometimes there's also something called swing states or purple states, meaning it could either go Republican or Democratic. During the general election, voters will pick who they want for the country's top position. These votes represent the popular vote and does not determine the actual winner. Presidential elections in the United States use the Electoral College process. Each of those electors are based on the state's representation in Congress, so you're not actually voting for the president directly, you're voting for the electors who then pick the president. Now, each candidate needs 270 votes to win the presidency. If they don't reach that, then the House of Representatives will pick a president, the Senate will choose a vice president. So in summary, here's a timeline of how a typical presidential election cycle works. The year before the election in the spring, candidates come forward. That same year, from about summer to spring of the next year, election year, the primaries and caucuses happen. Usually from January to June of election year, states hold primaries, caucuses, and other activities involving the candidates. From July to early September of election year, the list is narrowed down. Parties host the nomination conventions where they choose their candidates. About 2 months before Election Day, September to October, candidates take part in presidential debates. November is typically D-Day, Election Day, when voters head to the polls. In December, electors cast their vote in the Electoral College. And January, after the election year, Congress will count those electoral votes, and then a new president is inaugurated. Archit Seshadri, Wion.
So in a few weeks' time, America will elect their 45th president. It's been a dynamic election campaign. We are not done exploring it, but let's take a break now. When we come back, we're going to jump into a conversation about the power of social media in elections and how it's been used specifically in the US and India. Welcome back to Democracy and Dictatorship. We have with us in studio Richard Wion. He's the Managing Director for International Media Engagement with the US State Department. Also joining us is Arjun Sinha. Arjun is a lawyer who has worked extensively on political campaigns both at the national and at the state level in India. Thank you both for being here.
Thank you.
Let me start by asking you, Richard, could you tell us specifically how online and digital reach has changed the whole nature of the campaigns today, specifically in the US?
Well, I mean, it certainly played a significant role in shaping the narrative and getting more American voters, particularly young voters, involved and engaged. We saw how certain campaigns in the primary election were energized with the youth vote because of social media. I wouldn't say that it was necessarily because of the 2016 campaigns. I mean, obviously Barack Obama did a very great job of capitalizing on social media and using it to his advantage in 2008 and 2012. So it's definitely a force that campaigns have had to understand, and if you're going to win an election, you have to be able to talk to young people on social media.
Arjun, you worked on campaigns here. How has it changed? Has it changed the nature of elections in some ways, the coming in of social media and digital media? Or how different is it from earlier campaigns?
So I think 2014 sort of marked a watershed. Before that, largely engagement and outreach was either in person or it was driven by sort of standard traditional media. 2014 allowed especially an individual who wanted to sort of directly outreach and directly reach out to people and communicate with them. And technology, not only just social media, helped him do that a lot. And you would see that in and that really helped him because it helped him capitalize by being the first and have a first mover advantage on, say, Facebook or Twitter, and use it to identify issues, ask questions, respond to people, and be connected with a very young electoral base very early on. And that really helped in sort of developing a vote bank and developing support from a group that people usually missed out on, typically in history.
By 2017,
Yeah.
500 million Indians will have smartphones, or there'll be 500 million smartphones, let's put it that way. Is it going to change the total texture of these campaigns? Will people even be going out as much as they used to?
So what I don't think will change is the basic nature of elections and persuasion. That is, you have to reach out to people, you have to communicate with them, you have to influence them with your ideas and get support. What social media and technology, and especially mobile phone, will help is it'll happen much faster, and it'll be much easier for people to reach out to Indians in like far-flung corners of the country that just wasn't possible logistically earlier. It'll also be, I mean, if used correctly, it'll also be able to sort of understand and identify what are the issues and what are their needs. So, say if I had to draw a distinction between 2014 and 2017, technologically, while 2014 was marked the advent of use of Twitter and Facebook, I see 2017 and the subsequent campaigns also using basic messaging platforms to, directly reach out, share information, gather. The basics of elections, I don't think in the US or in India change. I mean, people will organize, people will move out, people will go to vote, people will collect into groups and discuss ideas. Just the platforms where this happens may change. I mean, it can be in your roadside corner, it can be in your dining room, or it can be in a Facebook group, or it can be in a WhatsApp group. So,
Richard, what we've seen through the campaign this time, both when it looked at the Democrats and the Republicans, Trump and Hillary, we've seen a single tweet can bring massive engagement, but also it's become murkier and dirtier in some ways. Do you think this path of much more murkier, dirtier campaigns is going to go on?
Well, I think the reason why these tweets or anything that gets put out on social media has a potential to be controversial is because you're hearing directly from the candidate's mouth, whereas you're not relying on campaign representatives or quotes from campaign managers. One of the things that Donald Trump has really used in Twitter is that he speaks with his own voice, and I think a lot of his supporters find that refreshing. A lot of his opponents use that to criticize him. That Hillary Clinton composed the tweet herself because she actually signs the tweets Hillary. So I think that the fact that you hear directly from the candidate themselves in the candidate's voice, I think causes a lot of discussion, and then that's where that generates both good and bad things.
Do you think people are learning actually more about elections because of this democratization of digital media at some level? That people actually begin even understanding a bit more which happened behind closed doors earlier.
Yeah.
Do you think this actually is going to change democracy in some way, in fact make a far more better electorate?
Yeah, I certainly hope so. I think that one of the things that social media has done in the last couple of election cycles is that it has brought the campaign closer to people, as I said before, in the candidate's voice. There's a lot more personalization there. People can share and comment, and I think that what really campaigns strive for on social media is to be able to bridge the online with the offline. So it's one thing for Trump to say something on Twitter, but if something that he says is so striking that traditional media have to report it or carry it, then I think that's where Trump and Hillary strive to get the maximum exposure. So it's the bridge between the digital and the traditional, the ability to speak in their own voice, the ability to connect directly with the voters. I think that's what has energized elections when you look at the role of social media. Now, what I would predict in the next couple of elections, as social media becomes more sophisticated, is you'll see a lot more interaction. You'll see a lot more personal outreach with the candidates. They'll be able to actually talk to voters. You have platforms now like Facebook Live and Periscope that where viewers can actually see live interaction, but the ability to actually reach across the digital spectrum to connect with those voters, I think it'll be very interesting to see that in the next couple of election cycles.
Richard, what you bring up is very interesting. In the last few years, we've seen a lot of the Indian political leaders have actually been delivering a monologue, and people aren't able to interact with it. They communicate through Twitter or they communicate through Facebook, and people aren't really able to kind of get really an understanding of what's going on. There aren't as many interactions. In fact, it's taken away a bit from the democracy. Is that true?
So I think it's also because we've had a political establishment that's sort of been careful with using media and engaging with media, and social media sort of automatically takes that and increases that to 1 million people at the same time. So the first steps have been slightly cautious, but I think going forward, I completely agree with Richard. It's going to become much more engaging. I mean, if you see, one of the things that we did was something called Chai Pe Charcha, which is it allowed people to directly engage with the political leader at their locality, at the neighborhood, through and ask them questions, and then they were beamed direct question answer sessions right close to the house. They didn't need to rely on a large rally or one-to-one interview for that process. I think that's going to go increase, and I think it's also going to be political leaders are going to be able to demonstrate how similar they are to their electorate, and social media is going to help them sort of get an insight on their lives, help them get an insight on what they think, how they perform, how they take decisions, and I think that's where things like Facebook Live or Periscope will sort of help bring in that intimacy in terms of how they go about their daily world, how they go about the decision making on a day-to-day basis, and create that engagement, saying, okay, this is a person I can rely on, this is a person I can trust.
Likes on social media, do they translate into votes?
It can only take you so far. It can just only still get you eyeballs at the end of the day, but it will not, if your issue doesn't resonate with the people, it will not get you support.
If you look at Facebook and Twitter users from 2012 elections to now, Facebook is up 60%, Twitter is up more than 200 million users. As we keep going this path, more and more people have access to social media, digital media. Is it going to help bring down cost of campaign? Because the expenditure on social media may actually be less than what it would have been on the usual, outdoor media, so to say.
It's certainly an issue in the United States in terms of campaign finance, and what's interesting about this particular campaign period, 2016, is that you actually have one candidate that's not spending a lot on ad buys in the United States, Donald Trump. You have one like Hillary Clinton who is spending a lot on commercials. That remains to be seen whether that will be effective for Trump. But what I think is one of the benefits of social media, and I think campaigns are beginning to understand this, is that it's low cost, it's instantaneous, it reaches directly to the people. Once these platforms like Facebook Live become more refined in their interaction, where there's instantaneous interaction, I think you'll see a lot of campaigns, both at the national and the state level in the United States, continue to use them more and more, because there'll be a cheaper way to connect with the voters. In the United States, we have this really great concept called the town hall. And you see this a lot in New England and parts on the East Coast. And what's great about the town hall is that it's a traditional way for Americans to gather at a certain place, and they hear directly from someone in authority, like a mayor or a council member, and they can challenge that person. They can say what's on their minds. And I think that's what Americans really hope to achieve with the national election. And candidates like Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump are trying to create that effect. And obviously they can't go around to every city and hold a town hall, but you see that effect. And I think that the more that happens on social media, the more that you have these digital town halls, that will be nothing but positive effects, I think, for campaigns.
Do you want to take that, Arjun? Is the cost of campaigning, is it going to go down based on social media?
So, I mean, it's still going to be, the startup costs are still going to be fairly significant and expensive. I mean, getting your supporters to join you and be a part of your campaigns and be a part of your streams of distribution per se is still going to be an expensive affair. But yes, I think it's going to help in sort of rapid information dissemination at a much lower cost. And it's going to help reduce, and so it's also going to take away the large expenses that you expend in countries like India and doing door-to-door outreach and convincing and reaching out to people. So I think social media is going to help in achieving that.
Issues and topics were always controlled by corporates for donkeys of years, if I may say so. But what's happening today with social media coming in? Social media is deciding what and they would charge money to make you trend. So how reliable is social media if it actually corporatizes the way corporates always existed?
Yeah. Well, I think that's always a topic that campaigns have to be mindful of. You know, as I said earlier, campaign finance is a controversial topic in the United States, not because of the amount of money that campaign spends, but because where that money comes from, right? I mean, a lot of that comes from interest groups. A lot of those come from wealthy donors or corporations who hope to influence some way the candidate. I would suspect that social media, if there was a capacity to finance ways, or if social media corporations started monetizing that way, there probably will be some incentive to get someone to pay for it. So I think it's a little bit too early to predict what would happen in the United States with respect to monetizing campaigns on social media, but there's always that danger to really control and to be transparent about how that money is spent.
Likes on social media, do they translate into votes?
So I think they're two separate things. In India, we're slightly different from where we are at the US, in the sense that I think there needs to be more transparency on where campaign finance does come from. And I think that's a separate debate in itself. But I think this whole thing of like farms and retweeting farms and everything is just, it can only take you so far. It can just only still get you eyeballs at the end of the day. But it will not, if your issue doesn't resonate with the people, it will not get you support. So, I mean, you can do this and get somewhere in terms of presence, but if it doesn't, it's not accepted by the people, it's not going to get you anywhere in terms of electoral victory. And secondly, I think it's also a question for these platforms themselves. Do they want, what kind of media do they want, what kind of content do they want, and if their policies and if they're not sort of vigilant in sort of weeding out these practices, it's just going to take away from the acceptability or the reliability of these platforms and hurt them in the long run. So I think they also have an incentive in checking down on these processes and helping sort of democracy in the long term.
Ethics around social media campaigns, is that a challenge? Are there ethics? People seem to jump that gun constantly. Richard?
Well, I mean, certainly the rules of the road are defined by who plays the game. I think that, as long as the process is transparent, as long as players are not excluded, as long as it's open to everyone, what you'll find is the ability for the community to govern itself, for the community to provide those rules and enforce those rules based on critiques, on ways that would get people to comply. But of course, ethics is who's playing the game at the moment, who's working the system.
I mean, I'd say in that sense, it's very easy to put some content out there and distribute it and let people believe it. But that's where instead of and the Indian tendency here is to get into regulation and sort of talk about the Election Commission getting into it and how can they stop it. I think it's best. And I think in this sense, the US provides a really good roadmap for this. You have a lot of citizens groups that are actively watching out the content that has been distributed and doing fact checks on it. And that in itself becomes a campaign strategy. If you see the Obama campaign, they had an entire team which is called the Truth Checker team, which just took Republican tweets and Republican statements and then gave out, what percentage of truth is in that statement and not. So, I mean, fact verification can be positively utilized, not only by media houses, but also as a campaign strategy in itself. So,
is regulation even possible? Because in some ways, with social media, sometimes democracy in itself is a casualty.
Anything is possible. And I think that if you look at how countries view social media and view the internet in general, it's always a topic of debate. And I think that's where India and the United States could be role models in that regard. The fact that we have such an open, transparent process, the fact that you have two great democracies who have their systems completely open, despite the fact that democracy can be noisy and dirty, I think is a good thing, and it shows people who live in other parts of the world that don't get a chance to vote every 2 or 4 years, or don't get a chance to participate in town halls or discussions and talk with members of authority. It could be a lesson. So yes, there's always a possibility to regulate, but I think that if you have the trend line moving towards keeping a fair and open process, one that's transparent, I think that that will be good for everybody. Thank you, Richard, for joining us. Thank you, Arjun. Democracies are democracies.
because they are transparent. Overexposure to the right information is never a bad thing. It helps mitigate the challenges of democracies, because nothing is absolute.